Forget the suave aristocrat in the black cape. Forget the cinematic vampire turning into a bat in the dead of night. We're shattering that myth entirely. We're plunging you directly into the visceral, blood-soaked reality of 15th century Eastern Europe. It's a world where survival literally meant absolute brutality, and where power, well, power was measured in terror.
It brings up a chilling question, doesn't it? What if the real Dracula was actually worse than the myth? Look, Bram Stoker's supernatural fiend is terrifying, sure, but the historical truth of this 15th century warlord, Vlad the Impaler, is far darker, far more calculating, and honestly, entirely human.
The divide is absolutely stark. On one hand, you have the mythological vampire, this creature of Gothic folklore. And on the other, you have the historical reality, Vlad the Impaler, a man who is a calculated, undisputed master of psychological warfare. But to understand how a man becomes a monster, we have to go back. We have to look at the incredibly dark origins of his cruelty. Before he was a warlord, you have to realize that Vlad was a political hostage. Back in 1442, Vlad's own father, the ruler of Wallachia, actually abandoned 11-year-old Vlad and his little brother Radu to the Ottoman Sultan, just to prove his loyalty. I mean, imagine that. Imagine being handed over to a foreign empire by your own father, and just plunged into this nightmare of survival and brutal education. Now, the two brothers reacted to this captivity in drastically different ways. His brother, Radu the Handsome, willingly assimilated into the Ottoman court. He converted to Islam, even befriended the Sultan's son. But Vlad fiercely and defiantly resisted, and for his rebellion, he was regularly whipped. Worse than that, he was forced to watch fellow Eastern European hostages be blinded with red-hot irons. In this court, he learned very early on that mercy was simply a weakness.
And then came the bloodline betrayal that broke whatever was left of his humanity. In 1447, his father was assassinated by Hungarian allies. That exact same year, his older brother was blinded with a red-hot poker and buried alive by treacherous Wallachian nobles, known as boyars. These devastating betrayals completely cemented his dark belief. Sheer terror was literally the only path to survival. By 1448, Vlad seized the throne.
So Vlad takes this deep-seated trauma of his past and completely turns it outward onto his own people. His revenge on the treacherous nobles who killed his brother was a masterpiece of calculated horror. He invited them all to a lavish Easter feast, but the exact moment they arrived, he ordered mass arrests. The older nobles were immediately impaled, left to die agonizing deaths on greased stakes. Meanwhile, the young were enslaved, marched up a mountain, and literally worked to death building his new castle.
He enforced domestic order through pure, unadulterated fear. Consider this chilling anecdote. Vlad placed a solid gold cup right in the middle of the town square in his capital, Targoviste. Out of 60,000 citizens, not a single person dared to steal it during his entire reign. Think about that. His psychological grip on Wallachia was absolute. And his domestic purges to enforce his strict moral code, unbelievably dark. According to local lore, to rid his realm of the quote-unquote burden of poverty, he invited hundreds of beggars and the sick to a massive feast. Once they'd eaten their fill, he locked the doors and burned the hall to the ground. Nobody escaped. It sets up this terrifying curiosity loop. If this is what he does to his own people, what on earth happens when this monster turns his gaze outward to his foreign enemies? Vlad's sadism quickly transformed into a brilliant, highly calculated military strategy against Sultan Mehmed II. First, he flatly refused to pay the mandatory financial tribute. Then, when the Sultan's envoys refused to remove their turbans in his court, citing their religious tradition, Vlad had the turbans nailed directly into their skulls. Finally, using the fluent Turkish he learned during his hostage years, he infiltrated enemy fortresses in disguise just to slaughter the guards. Massive Ottoman retaliation was inevitable. In a letter to the King of Hungary,
Vlad documented his own monstrous arithmetic in blood. He wrote, "We killed 23,884 Turks, without counting those whom we burned in homes." This isn't folklore, guys. This was his deadly, calculated efficiency.
The Sultan's response was overwhelming. 150,000. That is the massive size of the Ottoman army sent by Mehmed II to completely annihilate Vlad's tiny force of barely 30,000 peasants and militia. The feeling of impending doom must have been suffocating. Vlad simply could not win in a head-to-head fight.
Outnumbered, Vlad resorted to a nightmare-inducing scorched earth defense as he retreated. He poisoned the water wells with rotting animal and human corpses. He burned his own crops to ash so the invading army would starve. And, horrifically, he weaponized disease itself. He sent people infected with the bubonic plague and leprosy directly into the Ottoman camps. We are talking about 15th century biological warfare,
which all culminated in the legendary night attack on Târgoviște on June 17, 1462. In this adrenaline-fueled, totally chaotic assassination attempt, Vlad disguised himself and slipped right through the Ottoman camp in the dead of night. His forces slaughtered 15,000 Ottomans in their tents. Vlad personally sliced his way all the way to the Sultan's tent to cut off his head, but he attacked the wrong tent.
When the exhausted, terrified Ottoman army finally reached Vlad's capital city, expecting a final, decisive battle, they didn't find an army. They found 20,000. That number represents 20,000 decaying, impaled bodies of Ottoman prisoners, men, women, and children, hoisted onto greased stakes, forming a macabre forest stretching for miles outside the city walls. Birds were literally nesting inside the corpses.
The psychological impact of this was absolutely staggering. Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, witnessed this unimaginable atrocity and reportedly said, "A man who had done such things is worth much." This psychological warfare completely, utterly broke the morale of the invading force. In sheer awe and disgust, the Sultan turned his massive army around and retreated.
But a warlord who rules by the stake ultimately faces a violent end. In 1462, despite all his brutal victories, he was suddenly betrayed by his Christian ally, the King of Hungary, and locked away for 14 agonizing years. He finally managed to reclaim his throne in 1476, but his rule lasted only a matter of weeks. By early 1477, he was killed in battle against the Ottomans.
And his final fate was gruesome and, honestly, highly ironic. The Impaler was decapitated. His severed head was preserved in honey and paraded all the way back to Constantinople, where the Sultan proudly displayed it high on a spike.
Which leaves us with a final, incredibly provocative question. Was Vlad Dracula, a grim, God-fearing hero, doing absolutely whatever it took to defend his homeland from an unstoppable empire? Or was he a bloodthirsty, sadistic monster who exemplified the absolute worst parts of humanity? The truth, terrifyingly, is that he was both.
If you found this dive into the dark reality behind the myth fascinating, make sure to subscribe to History's Monsters right now. We uncover the terrifying true stories that textbooks always try to sanitize. Hit subscribe, and we'll see you in the next explainer.